This is our third lecture on the United States in World War II from Chapter 17, and this is focusing on the United States and the Pacific Theater of Operations in World War II. So, after Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Japan goes on a major advancement for the first 6 months of 1942, and they're able to conquer a giant empire in terms of land area. It's bigger than the Nazis, but again, it's conquering a lot of unoccupied oceans. We'll get through that as well. As we said when we were talking about in Chapter 16, Japan's plan for its offensive after Pearl Harbor is they're trying to isolate the Philippines away from American interference. And so 80,000 Americans and Filipinos are fighting against the Japanese when they turn their full attention into the Philippines. And the commander there, as we said in chapter 16, is Douglas MacArthur. The Japanese are able to show up in extraordinary numbers and force and are able to catch the Americans off guard and push them from the main islands in the Philippines down the Bataan Peninsula to the island fortress of Corregidor. And it's there that the Americans in the Philippines are kind of hunkered down as they're surrounded from there. MacArthur wants to stay, but in March of 1942, Roosevelt orders MacArthur to leave, and he looks around and says, "All right," and he takes off, leaving the rest of the Americans to be captured there. American POWs that are left are forced at bayonet without food and with very little water by the Japanese to march up the Bataan Peninsula towards the prison camps the Japanese for them, and this gets the name of the Bataan Death March, as a lot of soldiers are shot, bayoneted, or die from lack of nutrition or dehydration or other illnesses along the way. So it's not the baton, let's have fun march. It's called that for a reason. After Pearl Harbor and these 6 months, it looks to the United States, particularly public opinion, that the Japanese are this wide-ranging, unstoppable force, and the Americans are looking for some way, any way, to be able to get back at them. So on April 18th, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle decides to come up with a way to try to attack the Japanese. And what he does is he takes big, huge, giant bombers and he strips them of anything to get rid of their excess weights to be able to hold as much fuel and, more importantly, as many bombs as possible. Leads them on a aircraft carrier out into the middle of the Pacific, and from the farthest reaches that they're able to, in terms of fuel range, launch from there. And again, that's a technical feat in and of itself. Uh, Doolittle is one of the Americans. He's a very important in terms of aviation in the United States. He's one of the first. He's the first American actually to fly from coast to coast in the United States without any visual reference points. He's the first to do that by what's called flying by instruments, and so he's very famous in aviation circles before this. Now, the bombers, it's calculated, are going to have 30 seconds over Tokyo, thus the famous movie that's called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. And the bombs do some damage, but they really don't do a whole lot militarily. It really accomplishes nothing. A couple of broken windows, a couple of craters in Tokyo, but psychologically, it provides a huge boost for the United States. They've proven that they can do at least some damage to Japan in some form of retaliation for Pearl Harbor. More importantly, though, strategically, Japan is kind of caught off guard. They weren't expecting to have any attacks on the home islands, and now the United States are dropping bombs on them, and so they become very concerned. So they decide that they need to close off this corridor from where this ship came from, and so they move towards the island of Midway to close this off. So the leader of the American forces on the ground in the Philippines is Douglas MacArthur. We've talked about him in previous chapters, and it's his decision to leave the forces at Corregidor and leave to go back to Washington. Recall what he says from there, but in other people's view, all too willing to go, leaves the Americans there to be captured, and they are marched up the Bataan Peninsula, and again on the Bataan Death March, which is not great. In response to Pearl Harbor, the Americans are able to turn to Lieutenant James Doolittle, was able to come up with his raid of taking these B-24 bombers, stripping them to just the essentials, be able to fill them up with as much fuel and, more importantly, as many bombs as they can, be able to launch from these aircraft carriers. It was a technical feat in order to be able to get these aircraft off the carrier decks in order to be able to launch into the air as it is. And so it's a pretty famous thing. And again, they're launching from an aircraft carrier that's immediately going to turn tail and run. They've got a little bit of time to drop their bombs over Japan before hoping to be able to land in Soviet controlled Asia or into Chinese controlled Asia. But again, most of these pilots are expecting to not make it or fall into Japanese hands. The Japanese begin to expand farther out once they capture the Philippines. The Battle of the Coral Sea is a unique naval battle up at this point in world history in that no shots are fired by any ships on the surface against any other ships on the surface. All the fighting is done by aircraft, and this is really the beginning of what we see in terms of how the Pacific War is going to be fought as aircraft carriers are going to become the dominant thing. The Battle of the Coral Sea is the first time a Japanese invasion is stopped, and it really kind of shows that the Japanese can be beaten at certain points. As we said, the Japanese begin to move towards trying to cut off that Midway corridor and take over the island of Midway. And so in June of 1942, they begin to go and do that. Now, as we previously said, the United States has broken the Japanese code. The Japanese in May of 1942 are moving to switch to a new code, but through some bureaucratic and some kind of technical details that gets pushed to June and then gets pushed to later in 1942, and that allows for the Americans to be able to read all the messages. So the American military knows that Midway is the next target. However, it takes some convincing of the brass back in Washington and politicians to say why the Japanese risked a major port of their fleet to take any tiny little Midway. But they eventually agree, and then Admiral Chester A. Nimitz and Admiral Charles Parantzis are sent to go defend Midway from the battle from taking place from there. The Japanese aircraft carriers launch bombers to go attack the island defenses of Midway, and even though the Americans know the attack is coming, they're able to successfully do this. Remember, these are the same Japanese pilots who are going and fighting from there. Now, the Battle of Midway kind of goes back and forth. The Japanese release all of their airplanes to go from their aircraft carriers to attack the island. They don't know that the aircraft carriers for the Americans are in the area. The Americans don't want to risk their aircraft carriers, so they have them out of view. So they know the Japanese aircraft carriers are within about 150-mile radius, but they don't know exactly where. So both of these groups, the Americans and the Japanese, are sending out scout planes to go try and find where the other group is. It's the Japanese who send their planes out and find the American aircraft carriers, right? Just as the first wave of Japanese bombers attacking the island of Midway are returning back. And so the admiral of the Japanese, Nagumo, has to make a very important decision. Does he stop his second wave of airplanes to bomb Midway and replace them and their armaments and their bombs with bombs to go and able to attack the Americans' aircraft carriers once he finds out from there? And so he's kind of going back and forth. So he's giving kind of double messages to the different other commanders of the different aircraft carriers. And so as the Japanese are refueling and refitting the first wave of planes before the next wave goes out to attack Midway, or to there they have both sets of bombs in the deck. They have all sorts of fuel and ammunition and all sorts of explosive stuff on the deck. At that point, that American Dauntless the torpedo bombers show up, and these Dauntless torpedo bombers are being kind of flowed for with a very inexperienced group of pilots, and so the leader, Major Henderson, has them fly very low and slow along the decks, along the ocean waves to be able to lead towards these. And the Japanese fighter forces, again being owned by some of the best pilots and the best airplanes at the time, descend upon them and pretty much destroy these every single one of these different dive bombers. B-17s from Midway show up over them as well, and the slow plodding bombers of the Americans are also torn to ribbons. And so for the first two waves of attack on the Japanese aircraft carriers is pretty much complete and total Japanese victory. The Americans have very few surviving planes, and it looks like it's going to be a major defeat. But it's that moment that the entire Japanese aircraft defenses over their aircraft carriers has descended to take on the dive bombers and has dispersed to take on the B-17s, that the USS Yorktown and USS Enterprises dive bombers have showed up over the three Japanese aircraft carriers. Sometimes, again, we talk about change in history taking place in thousands of years, hundreds of years, decades, but here history turns in 5 minutes. Two bombs destroy one Japanese aircraft carrier. Another two bombs destroy another. A third aircraft carrier is destroyed and left sinking from there. And then the next day, a fourth aircraft carrier is destroyed. Within 5 minutes, the entire Pacific War is turned, and that's what makes the Battle of Midway so important. And Midway becomes an important turning point in the Pacific. What this begins is the United States advance towards Japan. Japan has lost its four aircraft carriers along with a lot of its airplanes and more importantly its experienced pilots in those airplanes. And the United States now begins to have an upper hand. This marks the United States advancement towards the islands of Japan and begins its plan of island hopping, which is what it sounds like, hopping from island to island to island to island across the Pacific to the Japanese home islands. And so this is how the Battle of the Pacific in the World War II is fought. It's fought not by big, huge, giant battleships like the Japanese feel, just like how World War I naval operations were fought. It's fought by airplanes from aircraft carriers, and the United States' ability to do that at Midway, launching planes from Midway Island here. Again, so you have these are the Dauntless torpedo bombers, which were pretty much all shot down from there before the dive bombers, right, were able to launch their attacks from the sky pretty much straight down on top of the four aircraft carriers from there. So the Americans begin to island hop from Tarawa to Peleliu, the Marshall Islands, the Carolines, right, towards the islands of the home islands of the Japanese. And again, these are pretty large operations from there. It's very hard fighting in the Pacific. The Japanese are a different type of enemy than the American soldiers have kind of usually fought, or what's kind of the Americans are quote unquote expecting to find from a quote unquote opponent from there. And so a lot of the tactics really surprise them and how much more brutality there is, unlike what this in the Pacific from there. The Americans in the Pacific are also using a lot of dogs like Dobermans or German Shepherds right from there. And again, as Americans, what do they do for where they go? They're going to play baseball as they move. Guadalcanal is the next major offensive for the United States. This takes place in August of 1942. This is the first Allied offensive operation in the Pacific. It's the first time the Allies are going to try to invade, in this case, the island of Guadalcanal, to protect the approaches to Australia. And with the loss of Guadalcanal, that marks the first Japanese defeat on land. We're going to kind of skip ahead. Between 1942 and October of 1944, it's island to island to island as the U.S. Marines move from there. By the time we get to the Battle of Light Gulf off the coast of the Philippines, the Japanese are really kind of grasping at straws here. The Japanese to try to protect the Philippines as much as possible through their entire fleet into the battle, including a brand new tactic that the Japanese are unleashing for the first time at light, and that's kamikazes. And these are suicide planes whose pilots purposely crashed their explosive-laden planes into American ships. And what that does is really change the course of the war here in the Pacific. Now, kamikaze means divine wind and refers to the typhoons which shattered the invasion fleet of the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan in the 13th century as the Mongols tried to invade Japan and were beaten back by these storms. Now the Japanese term for these suicide units was shimpu, which was a much more dignified reading for this, and that's how the Japanese referred to them. But we're kind of get the kamikaze name from there. So basically, what you're doing with these pilots is you're in these planes is turning them into cruise missiles. But instead of cruise missiles today, which are guided by electronics, these cruise missiles are guided by human brains. And so, very quickly, the Japanese realize that these can be very effective. And more importantly, you don't need experienced pilots in order to be able to launch a kamikaze attack. Uh, the major key difference as the Americans are able to work their way towards the defeated Japanese is that early in 1942, a Japanese Mitsubishi Zero plane crash lands pretty much intact in the Aleutian Islands. And so American engineers are able to take this intact plane, which is pretty much the best fighter plane in the world at this point. Again, you can argue and quibble right from there, and they're able to deconstruct it, figure out how it works, and create their own response to that, the F-6F Hellcat American fighter plane. And with that, along with more training time and better training resources, the American pilots are able to go and kind of able to do that. And the Japanese who are losing all this have to resort to tactics like this. Now, it's very hard to stop a kamikaze attack because even if you kill the pilot, you have to pretty much take out the plane because if the pilot's dead, the plane still continues on its crash course. And like we earlier said, it doesn't take you this. Over 480 ships are sunk in the Philippines by these kamikazes as they're going and attacking, causing all sorts of problems from there. The Battle of Lake Gulf is similar to the German Battle of the Bulge in that it represents a last gasp attack. The Japanese are throwing everything that they can from there, and its result, right, is a disaster for the Japanese. It destroys the power of the Japanese Navy, and pretty much the Japanese no longer can try to find any sort of holding off the Americans as they're going further from this. So this is Guadalcanal. If you read the book or seen the movie The Thin Red Line, it really does a good job of chronicling what the experience on Guadalcanal is for the Americans as they're fighting again through a lot of jungles and different terrain than what the used to. So here, as we move to Light Gulf, you can start to see some of the kamikaze attacks and what these are as these planes are trying to fight their way towards these ships in order to be able to blow them up that way. And again, just some different examples from this. And these are kind of very scary because again, the not only to the Japanese back at home are recognizing the sacrifices of these mostly graduate and university students at this point doing these suicide attacks, but I mean, it kind of shows you to the Americans just how fanatical the Japanese defense is going to become with the introduction of this new tactic that again on the deck of this aircraft carrier you can see the destruction that's rained upon from there begin to move forward. As we move into 1945, in February of that month, Iwo Jima becomes the next island to be attacked. Now, Iwo Jima is chosen because the United States is looking for an airfield. The B-29s that are flying from the Marianas Islands to Japan and back are running into problems over the skies from Japanese defensive planes and also from anti-aircraft fire. And so instead of losing these crews and pilots and expensive planes to the Pacific, they're looking to hopefully grab Iwo Jima as an emergency landing spot, kind of halfway between from there, and to be able to knock the air defenses from the island away from attacking bombers en route. Iwo Jima itself is pretty much a rock in the middle of the Pacific. It's dominated by Mount Suribachi on one end, and this dormant volcano is recognized by the Japanese defenders as the Americans take more interest into it, and it's pretty much turned into a fortress by the Japanese. Letters from Iwo Jima is another movie that chronicles the building of this as the Japanese just turn this into a literal island fortress with an elaborate cave system in the mountain and then also an extensive tunnel system from there. Japanese guns and machine gun nests from the defensive system pretty much marked every square inch of the island. And so when the Americans arrived from there, over 6,000 U.S. Marines died on Iwo Jima. 20,000 of them were wounded. And the quote that you should kind of take away with this is that they died with the greatest possible violence because there pretty much was no place to hide in the open plains of the island from the big guns and artillery from the mountain itself, and then plus the Japanese could pop up from the tunnel system, right, and spray off several hundred rounds of machine gun fire before popping down. To give you some small example of just how brutal the fighting was, that the United States actually ran low on flamethrower fuel because of how frequent they needed to use their flamethrowers in order to be able to root the Japanese out of the island. The Japanese on Iwo Jima died virtually to a man. Over 20,700 Japanese defenders died holding on to an, again, rock in the middle of the Pacific. And so with the Iwo Jima, it's important to understand, as you can kind of see, is, the war is going to end in August 1945, is that as the Americans get closer and closer and closer to Japanese home islands, the defense of the Japanese becomes increasingly more stark and suicidal and harder. And so the Americans are starting to kind of run into this idea of, well, what are the Japanese going to do? What's the final straw for what's going to stop that? Iwo Jima is also famous for its famous flag raising. Marines hiked up to the mountain and they raised a flag, but the commanders weren't happy with the size of that one, so they wanted a more ceremonial one. And so the second flag raising on Mount Suribachi was documented by the Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, and that's the famous picture that you're probably familiar with from Iwo Jima. So this is the strategic reason why they're looking for this. From the Marianas Islands, B-29s are flying across the Pacific to bomb Tokyo. And along the way, Iwo Jima and other islands are sending up defenses from there and causing problems for these pilots. And so they're looking for the Americans, Iwo Jima, as a emergency landing spot along this route to be able to help them out. So that's strategically what they're trying to do. This is a more recent in color picture of Iwo Jima, and as you can see, it's not a very big island. It's dominated by the dormant volcano Mount Suribachi on one end, and then a fielded plain on pretty much from all sides where the airfields were for the defense. There's Mount Suribachi, and again from there, and you can see the Japanese used their time in making preparations for the attack going forward. So by the time February turns around, this is the first wave of the U.S. Marines. Those aren't waves, those are white streaks of ships as the Marines are in their landing craft going towards the island. They're landing, it's famous because it's a volcanic island, those are black sand beaches of Iwo Jima. The Japanese let kind of the first wave land with little resistance and let them move up a little bit before opening on fire with pretty devastating results as the soldiers landed upon the island and worked their way in there. Again, it's not going to be great to be on the receiving end of one of these explosions from the big artillery guns on Mount Suribachi. And as you can see, after a couple of days of fighting, there really was no cover for the Marines as they're fighting their way in pretty brutal conditions off there. You can see what the takeaway from this photo is the amount of spent shells here from this machine gun as the Marines are trying to help cover their fellow Marines fighting on the island from there. Now, this you remember is the famous photo of Mount Suribachi, and you're probably going to yell at me, but no, it's not. Well, this is the first flag that was raised on the top after fighting their way to the top from there. But as you can see, it's not the biggest flag. We can do better. We're America. And so that leads to another group of soldiers who this famous picture is taken. And as you can see from the caption there, some of the soldiers who are on this picture don't even survive getting off the island, right, in the subsequent fighting to root out the last of the Japanese from there. So this is the famous flag raising from there. The Marine Corps leaders who saw this, right, said that this picture kind of guarantees the Marine Corps for the next 1,000 years. And so it's a pretty famous picture. What is Iwo Jima today? It's a graveyard representing not only the U.S. soldiers that died there, but also all the Japanese who died, again, fighting to be able to preserve this kind of open rock in the middle of the Pacific. And with the American success there, they were able to turn it into the emergency airfield that they were looking for on the island. After Iwo Jima, the next island is Okinawa. and attack is launched in April of 1945. Okinawa is important to understand that the Japanese consider this kind of the outer reaches of their home islands, and so Okinawa represents the first time the Americans are kind of quote unquote attacking Japan on what the Japanese consider their home soil, and so the defenses of the island are going to increase exponentially. Again, the reason for attacking Okinawa is the American bombers are looking for a landing strip, and so that's why that island is chosen. As told you, the Americans are running into increased defenses as they move towards Japan. Over 1,900 kamikaze attacks killed over 5,000 American sailors and seamen in around Okinawa. And so you can start to see just how there. And again, please keep in mind, every one of those 1,900 kamikaze attacks ends with a Japanese pilot dying. And so you can start to see just how willing the Japanese are willing to fight from there. The Japanese defense of Okinawa is marked with a tenacity to help protect, along with civilians on Okinawa as well. And that's what the Americans really start to get freaked out about, is that now even Japanese civilians who aren't in the army are helping protect there. And it's estimated that over 110,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians died in the defense of Okinawa. And so the Americans are saying they're going to have 20,000 Japanese die for Iwo Jima and 110,000 for Okinawa. What's it going to take Honshu or any of the other actual main islands from there? Okinawa sees the United States lose 7,600 soldiers, right, fighting across the island. So if you add the soldiers numbers with the seamen numbers, you're starting to look at 12,000 soldiers for one island. So this is the math the Americans are having to work with as they begin to launch and fight their way across Okinawa towards this, along with the attacks on the aircraft carriers. So as the Americans are trying to figure it out, they begin to see that maybe they're going to have to use even larger resources in order to be able to defeat the Japanese. And this is where the atomic bomb comes in. Now, the atomic bomb is in addition to the firebombing the Japanese cities are going under. The first use of a firestorm, a firebombing, is on the city of Dresden, Germany, on February 13th, 1945. And 1,400 aircraft dropped over 650,000 incendiary bombs. An incendiary bomb's purpose is to cause fires, and it left the city of Dresden pretty much leveled and over 130,000 corpses in the city as the fires became so intense. It actually whipped up a storm from there. And again, people were burned alive. People had their oxygen sucked out of their lungs because of how intense the fire was there. Because the American Air Force and British Air Force were able to do this in Dresden, they said, well, let's turn around and actually apply this to the Japanese. On March 9th through 10th, 1945, they firebombed the city of Tokyo. 15.8 square miles of the city was burnt. It got to be so hot in the city, the canal waters boiled over from there. American pilots described having the air pushing off of the city of Tokyo flip their big giant B-29s over because of how intense the airs were. And pilots said that they didn't need to use their instruments on the last couple of like half hour of flying towards Tokyo because the light of the city burning was able to guide them towards the city. It's estimated that over 100,000 people died in one night of this bombing, and the Americans left over 1 million Japanese injured from there. And again, that number is not really well known from there. This is just one day of a 10-day period in March of 1945 where the Americans bombed out 32 square miles of Japan's four largest cities and killed at least 150,000 Japanese plus tens of thousands or more, because at that point the uh, um, the numbers kind of get a little fuzzy as you're trying to figure out where all the people are. Why is it not 11 or 12 or 13 days? Because they had no more bombs to drop on the Japanese, so the Americans had to stop in order to be able to build up their responses. So this is what the Americans are doing in March of 1945. So imagine what it's going to take, all right, to be able to get out from there. Well, this is the city of Dresden. This is in February of 1945, and you can see as from there, just to give you an idea of how complete and total the damage to the city was. Uh, you're going to see again this same picture taken 10 years later, where it's pretty much leveled out from there. And so the invasion of Japan is being planned as the Americans go through Okinawa and Iwo Jima. And so the timetable is set after Okinawa to invade the Japanese whole islands in November of 1945. The goal is to defeat Japan between 1947 and 1948. And this is going to require over 650,000 ground troops to invade the home islands of Japan. This is going to put the D-Day invasion to shame. It's estimated by the American kind of high brass that they're going to experience a 35% casualty rate on day number one of the invasion, which is going to translate to about 68,000 American soldiers dead and wounded after day one of this planned invasion of Japan. It's estimated that 30 to 50% of what would probably be the largest invasion feat in history would be lost to kamikaze attacks. And this is on top of the American soldiers in the Pacific theater who are kind of already gone from island to island to island. Very few have rotated back home. So there's a very much a sense of hopelessness and despair in the Marines, in soldiers in Germany who are beginning to say, hey, when are we going to have to go to Japan and fight over there? And everyone's kind of done. So that's kind of the stage from there. So let's circle back, just review for a second. The United States is building up its atomic bomb through the Manhattan Project. At its peak, there were over 120,000, 130,000, depending on your numbers, people in 37 different facilities across 19 states and Canada, and it cost over $2 billion for the United States. Just to give you some idea, again, how big the Manhattan Project is, in 1943, the Manhattan Project is responsible for one half of all the U.S. Army construction. So everything the U.S. Army is building around the world, one half of it is going just to the Manhattan Project, and it's using more steel than the U.S. Army and the U.S. steel industry combined is in 1943 as it's building all that stuff for the rest of the globe. What does the Manhattan Project yield? On July 16th, 1945, the first successful atomic test is made at the Trinity Test Site in New Mexico. And it's at that point that Truman, at the Yalta Conference, sees that test and he signs off and he says to make plans for dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japanese targets. Why only 2? Because that's really how many they have. In July 16th, the United States has 3 atomic bombs ready to go, one for a test and then 2 others. And Truman says, let's do it the 2, knowing that he's going to have more atomic bombs as they go. The USS Indianapolis is given the secret mission to deliver the atomic bomb in the Pacific. And the famous story of the USS Indianapolis, which is retold much better than I could ever do by Robert Shaw in the movie Jaws, is because the mission is so secret that when the Indianapolis delivers the bomb and starts to sail back, nobody knows about this. And so a Japanese ship sinks the Indianapolis to the bottom of the ocean. Only a fraction of the crew is able to bail out into the ocean because no one knows they're there. They just kind of huddle together as sharks begin to arrive and chop them up. And again, it's worth watching Robert Shaw and Jaws deliver that story. Well, this is the nuclear test site for the first nuclear bomb at the Trinity Test Site in Los Alamos. And at the very top here, at the top of this tower, is where the bomb is going to be fired off right in the first place. And this is the pictures that it's taken from there. All right, and so you can kind of see the first couple of milliseconds as it goes. Again, we want to highlight that this is not black on there. That is actually the brightest point of the entire um, explosion, and it's so bright and intense that it's actually burned a hole through the film. That's why it's dark right there. So again, pretty powerful stuff. This is the famous Eye of Trinity shot, as you can kind of see nuclear fission happening, an explosive thing, right? The first time it's happened, as we know of, in the universe, other than in the stars. What did it leave? A big, huge, giant crater in the middle of the desert. You can The heat from the atomic bomb was so intense that it turned the sand into glass uh, from there, and so it kind of you can see um, how just intense it was. These are glass beads formed by the intense heat and pressure from the atomic bomb in there. So the first bomb is dropped on August 6th, 1945, as the B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, releases a uranium-fueled bomb over Hiroshima. It then peeled out and got the heck out of there as fast as it could. As 43 seconds later, the bomb detonated over the city, and pretty much the city effectively ceases to exist. A nuclear explosion equal to 12.5 kilotons. That's the same amount as if 12,500 tons, a ton is 2,000 pounds of TNT was exploded. Now, just to give you an example of how far we've advanced from this, this is equal to one modern atomic artillery shell. And presently, the United States has Minuteman III missiles that are able to deliver 84 Hiroshima's worth of nuclear explosives, right, at a moment's notice. The fireball in Hiroshima instantly raised surface temperatures within a mile of the hypocenter to above 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypocenter is the point of where the bomb um, actually detonated. To give you some idea of the intensities of the heat, um, the the bomb went off with a flash of light of instantaneous flash of heat. The duration of this flash of heat was less than 1/10 of a second, and its intensity, however, was so sufficient to be able to cause nearby flammable objects to burst into flame and to char poles as far as 4,000 yards away from the hypocenter. At 600 to 700 yards, the bomb was sufficient to chip and roughen granite, which is one of the hardest substances on Earth. The heat produced bubbling of tile up to 1,300 yards away from the detonation zone. It was found by an experiment to produce this effect of a temperature of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, acting for 4 seconds. But in Hiroshima, it was different, and so you can kind of just see from there. The flash was so hot that it instantly raised a person's skin temperature to 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the first millisecond, up to 2.3 miles away from where the bomb went off. And so that's a lot of numbers given at you, but that should give you an idea of just how powerful and intense this was. The Japanese don't know what hit them, right? And so they're trying to still figure it out when 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. This was a plutonium fueled bomb, and so it gave a higher yield of 22 kilotons. But the difference of geography between Hiroshima and Nagasaki's kind of in, you want to think of like a bowl, and so the shock wave was kind of contained, where Hiroshima's on a big flame. So you can kind of think of the hand of God just coming out and flattening everything from there. That's just within it from there. By the end of 1945, it's estimated that there's over 200,000 deaths both on August 6th and August 9th, along with injuries and the effects suffering from radiation poisoning as well. And so that's the Hiroshima detonation there on the left. You have the ironically named Little Boy atomic bomb at the top, and then Fat Man at the bottom there. Just try to describe the middle. The pictures don't really do this justice because this is 13 feet or something. It's several feet long, where this is a little bit more shorter and compact. Because again, these are big, huge, giant bombs. This is Hiroshima. This is before, and so you can kind of see there's the center of where it will detonate. So keep your eye on the bridge there. That's where the bomb explodes over the surface, and then as it explodes, this is what's left standing from there. And as you can see, it's not much. The intensity of the atomic bomb going off, you want to think of like a flash, and just how a flash from a phone might cause a shadow to appear on the wall, is that again, this is gamma radiation. This is the same stuff that turns Bruce Banner into the Hulk, right? Strips the atoms and electrons from people's bodies, so they just cease to exist, and the only thing that's left is a burned outline, right, of their shadow on there, right? And so that's what it's going to do to people close by. And so imagine the heat and intensity from the stuff from there. This burning on this little child hair, the mask of Hiroshima was a pretty famous effect. This is Nagasaki, so again, it's ringed by hills and mountains, so it's a little bit more of a bowl. So it's going to be a little bit more contained. Keep your eye here in the center of the stadium is kind of this before picture. As we move to the after, you can kind of see as it's all been moved and stuff from there. So again, the two different types of bomb here. Nagasaki is actually a much more effective bomb, but Hiroshima, based on its geography, has more destruction around again because the shockwave is able to travel a little bit farther and faster, and that's where we'll stop uh, for this chapter.